Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abhijit Singh. I'm a senior fellow here at the Observer Research Foundation, and I also head the Maritime Policy Initiative. I'm going to be the moderator for the session today. At the outset, let me begin by extending a very warm welcome, but also expressing my gratitude to all of you for having come for this session today. For a Thursday afternoon, this is about as houseful as it gets. So this also says something about the enthusiasm and the interest that the National Security Dialogues. This is a new series that we've started. This is the third edition, but it speaks to the zeal that we have managed to evoke among people, and it's very heartening to see that there's so much of interest on a subject that I would say is a bit unusual as far as the Indian security discussions are concerned. This is somewhat beyond the pale of our security focus. We like to look at more in the maritime domain at Indian Ocean issues, but this time we decided to do something on the South China Sea. And the reason we have planned this event on the South China Sea is that there's been a lot that's been happening in that part of the world. China recently came up with a new map. It's unveiled new map that has replaced its old 9-dash line with a 10-dash line, apparently. Now, they did release a 10-dash line a few years ago, but since then, it's always been the 9-dash line that they've talked about. Now there is an extra dash that's come close to Taiwan. Pooja and the others are going to talk about it. But this is a bit worrying, and this has resulted in a great sort of backlash in the region where a number of countries have protested what China has done. They say that China's claims are illegal, and it's only trying to grab land and territory that belongs to these countries. So basically, this is a fight for the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones that are overlapping in the region. Now, our focus today is really going to be on what's the implication of all of this for India and for Indian interests. So in the main, we are going to be focusing on two questions. How do these developments in the South China Sea, the disputes, the maneuvering, counter-maneuvering that you see, the maritime exercises, how is that going to affect the security dynamic in the Indian Ocean, particularly the Eastern Indian Ocean that India dominates? And second, if China has a better hold or a firmer grip over the islands of the South China Sea, does that implicate the balance of power in maritime Asia? Meaning, does that have an impact on India's interests and the balance of power in the Indian Ocean? Could this be the beginning of China's power projection in the Indian Ocean region? We have an excellent panel today to discuss this. 5 great speakers, and I'm going to introduce first the people in the room. Commodore Anil Jay Singh. He's a leading voice on maritime affairs, the Vice President of the India Maritime Foundation, a close friend. He always has a thing or two to say about any development that happens in the maritime domain, so we can do without having him on the panel. Pooja Bhatt. Pooja is an independent researcher. She's worked earlier with the Center for Air Power Studies, also a very keen voice on the South China Sea, and in fact, even has a book on the South China Sea. Online, we are very fortunate today to have amongst us Admiral Sunil Lanba. Welcome, sir. The Admiral was Chief of the Navy between 2016 and 2019, at the time that China was beginning to make its presence felt in the Indian Ocean region, but also reclaiming a lot of those features and turning them into artificial islands in the South China Sea. So perhaps from him, we will hear a very naval sort of military perspective of what the security establishment thinks about Chinese activities in this region. Colin Coe, I don't see him, but he should be joining us. Colin is at the moment in Amsterdam. He's our regional expert. He's with the RSIS in Singapore. And from him, we can hope to hear a regional perspective of what's actually happening within the South China Sea and how are all the countries reacting to China's aggression. And last but not the least, we have Amrita Jash, who's an assistant professor at the Manipal Academy for Higher Studies. Also a very prominent scholar of China and China's military strategy, actually. So welcome, Amrita. From here, from you, perhaps we will get to hear something about China's gray zone warfare. But I'm going to go first to Pooja. And Pooja, I come to you because you have a book. You've spent a lot of time researching the subject. And your book's actually called The Nine Dash Line, Disputes in the South China Sea. So you're obviously my first choice to kick off this panel discussion. So you have the floor.
Thank you, first of all, to Abhijit sir for having me here and giving me this thought that might as well I reconsider the name of my book because now it's 10-line, 9-line is not maybe relevant. And thank you, ORF, for having me today for this discussion on their national security series. It's an honor to be here and sharing the panel with people whose work I've admired for years. And now I'm sharing the panel with them. So as Sir said, I've been following the maritime affairs in terms of Chinese maritime affairs for quite some time now. And this discussion is based on my book right now and what the implications could be. So basically, the talk is divided in 3 parts. First of all, we'll be talking about the origins of these maps and why these maps are important to consider from a strategic point of view. You can very well refute it. We can debate about it later. Second part of the talk would be talking about the context of these maps, because the timing under which these maps have come are very interesting, and we need to also bring that context into the talk. And third part, I'll be talking about definitely the implications for India. So as you can see the map here, on 28th August 2023, Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources came out with this map and 2 newspapers, Chinese newspapers, Global Times and China Daily, both simultaneously released it on Twitter, and they were talking about it. The important thing about these maps is now they have a new map which not only have covered gone ahead from their 9 dashes, which was previously, into 10 dashes. Also, they have covered several parts of India, the Sichuan and northeastern part of India. So this map is a new version of how Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources sees it. The next slide, please. If we enlarge these maps, we can see that the origin of these would be starting from 2009. That was the first time we saw China coming out with a dash line at the international level. And this map was released by China at the UN when the Philippines had gone against China in PCA, Permanent Court of Arbitration, to complain about Chinese aggressiveness in the South China Sea. So the middle map that you're seeing, 2000 map, was the rejoinder map that China has produced at the UN to show how these the territories there. And that you would see there are 9 dashes in that map. So when this map came up, a lot of scholars started doubting and started asking questions about what are the origins of this map, 2009 map. They have produced another map showing a 1947, the left side map, if you see. And this is a map when the Kuomintang government was there, and there was China and ROC and PRC was kind of maybe together. So this is one kind of map which is debatable again, but both agreed by China and Taiwan in terms of its existence. So we can debate about its existence. These 2 countries definitely agree to this map, and these 2 maps have 9 dashes, if you see. What is interesting about these 2 maps is if you overlap these 2 maps, the dashes do not coincide. So that shows the arbitrariness of these maps. Basically, there are no direct geographical coordinates when you talk about these maps, which in turn also tell us that these maps are not very thought of in terms of geographical locations, but they just arbitrarily made some maps and they have been following those. In 2016, when China lost its case against Philippines in PCA, Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the arbitration said that these dashes do not hold any value. We did not hear about these dashes for a good amount of time. Till now, even China was not referring to 9 dashes in any of the statements being talked about, any of the ministers talking about maritime affairs. Never we heard all these years in 5, 7, 8 years of the 9 dash line. Fast forward to 2023. 28th August, we see this map. What was the context of this map coming up? International context first. We were having a G20 meeting, about to have G20 meeting around that same time. ASEAN meetings and East Asian Summit meetings were going on. Prime Minister was there. Xi Jinping wasn't there. He wasn't attending the G20 either. Instead, the Chinese premier attended all these events. BRICS, on the other hand, when we were expecting some kind of talk happening in BRICS on a bilateral side, that didn't happen. So that was internationally that one thing. Another thing is India has been supplying these missiles as well as boats, INS Kirpan that we gave to Vietnam. So these are the kind of defense supplies India has been doing to this Southeast Asian countries in terms of its Atmanirbhar Bharat and look East Asia policies and everything. What is interesting is neither of these times we heard from Chinese that they made any statement. None of the times they had a very strong thing to say, which we were expecting them to come out when India was doing all these activities. And there was quite kind of lull from Chinese end. That was very interesting to see. Third interesting point internationally was China's ongoing differences with its Southeast Asian neighbors. And if you've been following the news recently, China has been intensifying its efforts in South China Sea. It has been having rigorous contestations with Philippines, with Vietnam, with Taiwan, and all the Southeast Asian neighbors. The differences had only multiplied over the time. Then upcoming Taiwan election and China's position on Taiwan has been intensified over the time. Lastly, we have also seen that a lot of countries are doing exercises in South China Sea, including ASEAN. If you talk about recently, they did their own inaugural exercises. India did exercises with ASEAN. A lot of other countries are doing their exercises. So internationally, South China Sea has become a hotspot for a lot of contestation at the moment. On the other hand, if you also see the domestic context under which this entire map has come, the new map, we need to go through the statements that Global Times and China Daily had written. And these are some of the statements directly put from those news reports, in which it directly says that the occasion under which China released this map was the 30th anniversary of its law of surveying and mapping of People's Republic of China. So they gave a kind of occasion to the release of the map. They also wanted to bring about awareness publicity week when it comes to national mapping. Means if you try and interpret it, it's like they want to give the national boundary a national awareness issue, which is a very domestic issue again. Very interesting thing was a quote that I found by their chief planner, which was Wu Wechong, who said that these maps would be supporting the management of natural resources on the one hand, helping the ecology and civilization of China. So it's kind of giving a domestic legitimacy again. Third very important point that I found in those newspapers and the statements they were given was they're talking also of national sovereignty. So by putting out one map, they are trying to kind of shape a picture that they are doing it for the ecological purpose, for the national awareness purpose, for the natural resources purpose, because China has been looking for natural resources. However, if you see at the international level, the ramifications are different. With these two contexts, I would want to also I thought it would be wise enough to look into the interpretations of these maps. If you read carefully, these are not the navigation maps or maps that are used in general. These are maps for posterity. If you talk about 2009 map, which made 9 arbitrary marks or dashes, and then not talk about it, but try to still increase your aggressiveness when it comes to your sovereignty about these dashes. So that was one. Now what we have in 2023 is enlargement of that. So that in that sense, they're normalizing the entire narrative of Chinese sovereignty over these areas, the land areas as well as the maritime areas. Whether it is for domestic consumption or international consumption is something we can debate right now. Second thing we need to think about is how does this release of this map helps in Xi Jinping's own legitimacy, which is waning. The Chinese economy is in doldrums. The ecology, we can see every now and then they have, ecological disasters, floods and everything. There is huge purging of domestic leadership in terms of military leadership and political leadership. Their economy, the unemployment is on all-time high. So in all these kind of, domestic environment, Xi Jinping requires a legitimacy. So does this map provides him the kind of legitimacy that he's seeking is one question we need to seriously look at. And last, I would want to interpret it as the expansionist and misleading narrative. And this map has been rejected by 10 countries, including Nepal, Russia, and USA. USA being one of the extra regional country also, try to call out this map saying it's misleading basically. But what China has used, the sentence that they used when they released the map was the map has been compiled based on drawing methods of national boundaries of China as well as various other countries. Was it so is the question. Were other countries consulted in drawing these maps is the question. Lastly, we'll talk about the India, the implications of 10-dash line on India, basically. As Sir also has written, a lot of scholars have written, India's current position in terms of the dash line map, and the entire map is, we have rejected, the Indian EM has rejected these territorial maps, saying it will only confound the dialogue process that is going between India and China. However, when it came to maritime, we did not say anything much. And also, if you see logically, India's position in South China Sea, it's not our immediate area of concern. So we are not bothered about it. We might not have that kind of wherewithal right now to be continuously present in South China Sea. And there are other, economic and diplomatic reasons for why we don't see South China Sea as an immediate threat. But I would urge everyone to think in a different perspective. Should it matter to India? And I would say it should matter to India. For the first reason that we are now enlarging our maritime vision. We have Sagar, which looks into the Indo-Pacific and our regional countries. Then we are also expanded our vision to Indo-Pacific region, where we are trying to engage with Indo-Pacific countries on the maritime domain in various ways. And thirdly, India is a country that is seeking to be a blue economy. And to be a blue economy, you need to have a blue navy, which can sustain outside its own easy for the longest time. They can supply themselves, they can sustain themselves. So for that region, I'm not just saying South China Sea, but it overall far off seas, high seas, India needs to be present. And for that, India should be seeing South China Sea as one of those regions where India has to sustain itself. Secondly, I'll talk about India's principal position that we've been talking about, that we believe in rule of law, we believe in maritime global order, we believe in justice and equality of all states. With this viewpoint of India of having a principled position on these issues, I think India also needs to take a principled issue when it comes to South China Sea, which we haven't taken yet most of the time. Third thing I would want to talk about, we should not see these maps and Chinese actions only as military action. We need to think it more at Chinese lawfare, Chinese aggressiveness against global commons. We do not talk about global commons yet. We don't talk about high seas. We don't talk about Arctic. We've started talking about space. These are the global commons where China is now trying to reach out, put some kind of, how South China Sea started was putting some, fishermen caps and belongings to some, random islands, and then coming back and claiming that it's ours. It's something like that, just put some of your belonging at some terra nullius where nobody has ever been, and then start marking it as your own area. So this is the kind of lawfare we are seeing with China. And I think from that perspective, India should also start preparing itself and its own narratives regarding South China Sea and maritime issues. And lastly, I would want to finish it with that as the time is increasing, as we are seeing this conventional as well as sub-conventional warfare going on, what is another area of warfare we'll be increasingly seeing would be norms and values and clashes on that. Because countries are interpreting these norms and values differently, and increasingly we are seeing how in multilateral level countries are having their differentiations in terms of how they see particular norms. And in that regard, how China would be shaping the entire region multilaterally by revising norms and values is something India should be also concerned about. So I think this is the overview point that I would want to see the entire issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja, for that terrific presentation. I think you brought out the salient features of both the 9-dash line as also the imperatives for India to play a bigger role in the region. It's clear that for a while, there's been this sort of false notion that the South China Sea is a distant sea space, that what happens in the region does not really matter to India because our interests are in the Indian Ocean. I think that notion in just the past few years has been thoroughly debunked. We meaning New Delhi, India is one of the foremost proponents of the idea of the Indo-Pacific. And that means that we recognize the interconnections between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And that key interface between India and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is actually the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal. That's the buffer zone between these two spaces. And India must recognize our stakes in that part of the world. I'd just like to highlight one issue and perhaps try and elicit a response from you, Pooja. In some of the interactions that at least some of us in the ORF have had with our counterparts in Southeast Asia, the dominant emotional register for the region is actually nationalism. This is not just a fight over territory. It's just not a fight because really speaking, this is not territory they're fighting over. They're fighting over exclusive economic zones. So really they're fighting over resources. But this is just not a fight for resources. This is a clash of narratives. And as you rightly pointed out, the Chinese go back a long way. They go back to the 3rd century BC, the Han, and that's when they say that was the first time that these surveys were carried out, the 14th century, 16th century, the Ming dynasty, Qing dynasty. And so they say that this is not a cartographic exercise for us. For us, this is a question of legacy. It's a question of identity. Now, these are similar narratives we get to hear from a lot of other countries that they're invested in the region because this has to do with the very question of their identity. And I want to know from you that is there an easy way out of this? Because this is not just about countries abiding by the law. It's easy to say that have UNCLOS and all of you talk and peacefully resolve your differences. But the fact that everyone seems to have differing interpretations of each other's histories. And also this is a gray space in which not just China, but a number of other countries are doing their own reclamation. They are doing their own gray zone activity, maritime militias, etc. What's the way forward for someone that has a book on this? I'm sure you've gone into these questions, but what do you think is the way forward? Should we be looking beyond the UNCLOS or just limit ourselves to a very legalistic understanding of the South China Sea and then try and take it from there?
I totally agree to the fact what you said that no other country has learned better at map making and use of map making than China. That is absolutely true. And now that is the weapon. Map making is now a weapon that is used against everyone else. Completely agree to that. There is no easy way out of it because we all are interpreting the laws of international maritime laws in different way. What has actually made easier, I think, and in times will become easier would be the awareness of international maritime laws. The only reason I think over the years China could do what it could do in the South China Sea was most of the Southeast Asian countries were so busy with their resetting their colonial past and get away with that China could overcome to come out with maps and everything and reclaim everything in the South China Sea. And till now, I would say if you talk to Filipinos, I think quite recently Vietnamese and Filipinos, till now they were not very much conscious of how this is going to play against them at the maritime law, legal warfare level. But now not only there is an awareness among Southeast Asian countries, they are also on the same plate when it comes to interpreting those laws, which is very important because then we have all these countries interpreting international laws in one manner. And then we have China, on the other hand, which has interpreted it in a completely different manner. So instead of having so many countries having so many interpretations, we have two clear, teams now. So I think over the years, might get into a direct clash, but it might also make things easier for us to understand.
So what you're saying is essentially dialogue is the way forward, and that no one can have a disagreement with. I'm now going to come to Admiral Sunil Lamba and ask him to make his remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Like Pooja said, the dash lines first emerged in 1947 as an 11 dash line. In the rule of Chiang Kai-shek and ROC. And in 1952, Chairman Mao removed 2 dashes from the Gulf of Tonkin when they had some sort of a socialist bonhomie with North Vietnam. Very little, and this 1947 U-shaped 11 dash line demarcated roughly about 90% of the South China Sea. That is what the Chinese claimed, and they had their own historical narratives. But the other claimants of the South China Sea have their own historical narratives of laying their claims to the South China Sea water. Very little came out on the Chinese maps issue and the attention to the South China Sea till 2009. Like Pooja said, the submission to the UN on the continental shelf and the issues they are having with Vietnam. Now, Philippines lodged their case in 2013, where the arbitration ruled against China in 2016, saying that there is no legal basis for this maritime claim to its 9 dash lines, and it's been superseded by the 1982 1 clause of the United Nations Conventions of the Laws of the Seas. Now, this new 10 dash line, which includes an additional dash around Taiwan, has been issued, as he said, on the 28th of August, just after President Xi Jinping declared at the BRICS summit that hegemonism is not in China's DNA. So whenever there has been a power vacuum in the South China Sea, the Chinese have been forwarding their claims, like they post the withdrawal of the United States from Vietnam. There was a clash which took place with the Vietnamese. The Chinese reclaimed some of the islands in the Spratlys group. Then, while the attention of the United States was diverted in the Middle East from 2013 to 2015, they did a major reclamation and building of artificial islands on 7 coral reefs in the Spratlys group. Basically, you had Mischief Reef, the Ferry Cross Reef, and the Subi Reef, where when people objected, they said, no, this is just development activities. There won't be any militarization of these facilities. And now they've been fully militarized, with almost each of them having a 3,000-meter airstrip with anti-ship missile, anti-aircraft facilities, with fighters and all based there. So they are dominating the South China Sea. And when you look at the past 2 decades, no nation has invested so much in military buildup since the Second World War than the Chinese. If you look at, and there are a major maritime power to be reckoned with. Within the first island chain in the Western Pacific, they are a power to be reckoned with any other military power, including the United States, in my opinion. They, as far as shipbuilding capacity of merchant ships are concerned, they have 48% of the world market. They are the second largest owners of merchant ships, almost 8,000 vessels, which accounts for about 14%. Numerically, the Chinese Navy is the largest navy, almost 355 ships. They have the largest coast guard in the world, the largest maritime militia, the largest fishing fleet. So it's a maritime power to be reckoned with, and it's a regional power, and they're pushing the narrative of what they want on the territorial claims. And there's very little the Southeast Asian countries can do. The power differential, both economically and militarily, is so huge. Now, if you look at the deployment of the Chinese Navy. Basically, it was a coastal force, and the first time it set off outside of China was in the late 80s, early 90s, where the training ship paid a visit to the Indian Ocean, including putting into a port in India. But thereafter, very little happened. It was only in end 2008 when the first deployment of a task force called the Anti-Piracy Escort Force, consisting of 3 ships, a destroyer and a frigate, supported by a tanker, was deployed in the Gulf of Aden to sort out piracy which was happening there. And they have been there continuously since then. Initially, to start with, the Anti-Piracy Escort Force would spend about 4 months in the area without putting into any port and go back. As they gained confidence in their long-range deployments, the Anti-Piracy Escort Force, after being relieved in 2013, one group went all the way around Africa, through the Suez, around South Africa and back. One group went through the Mediterranean, went to Europe, came back. One group crossed the Atlantic, put into ports in Canada and America, went through the Panama Canal back home. So between 2013 and 2017, the Chinese Navy was all over the world. Their first deployment of submarines to the Indian Ocean took place in 2013. Generally, they had 2 deployments in a year. It started off with a conventional boat supported by a submarine tender or a support ship, and they would spend about 90 days and go back. The second boat was a nuclear boat, and she did the same thing. And as per my knowledge, the last deployment of a Chinese submarine took place in 2018. Okay. So China is a maritime power to be reckoned with. Now, looking at South China Sea and our own interests, we have a very large segment of our trade, maritime trade, which transits through the South China Sea. So we have an interest there. It's not that we have neglected the South China Sea. There has always been an annual visit of a ship to Vietnam. The oldest bilateral exercise which we've been having has been with Singapore. So every alternate year, it takes place in Singaporean waters and the South China Sea and out here. We also deployed ships. Now Malabar takes place in the Western Pacific, alternate years. And there has been a focus on building maritime capability and capacity of nations in the South China Sea. Like we have supported Vietnam, the form of transfer of ships, spares, technical assistance, also given them a line of credit through which they have built a number of fast attack crafts. The latest is with Philippines, where they signed a contract for the supply of BrahMos missiles. We've helped set up maritime domain awareness, coastal radar chains in Vietnam. We have an agreement with a number of countries there for sharing of information. Now, looking at the Chinese Navy and the deployment in the Indian Ocean region, it's not that the entire Chinese Navy can be deployed to the Indian Ocean. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that in the last decade, the Chinese Navy has added over 150 ships to their orbit, which is the size of the Indian Navy. They've added more ships into the Navy than all the other 9 navies, large navies put together. There is no match for their productivity of the shipyards. And it's not only small platforms, I'm talking of blue water platforms in the form of aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates. So when we did an analysis a couple of years back of what could be the deployment of the Chinese Navy in the Bay of Bengal or the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, at best, they would be able to deploy about 20 blue water ships and support them, because it's a long logistic chain of almost 4,000 nautical miles. Okay. They have the first overseas base in Djibouti, but that is in one corner of the Indian Ocean. Okay. Now there is a base coming up in Cambodia, which will shorten the distance. So as far as their deployment, the force levels in the next coming decade or so, I think the Indian Navy is very well capable of what forces the Chinese Navy can bring to bear Indian Ocean, and the balance of power rests on our side. Same way, if you look at the South China Sea, the balance of power rests with the Chinese. Okay. If you have to deploy when there are tensions are high, you'll have to have logistic support facilities of countries of ASEAN. We have an agreement with Singapore. We can count on Vietnam, but whether they will allow operational turnarounds of our ships and aircraft at that particular point of time, only time will tell. So as far as the Indian Ocean region, in the coming decade, I'm quite confident that the Indian Navy is well capable of looking after. But as a nation, we need to invest much more in our maritime capability. We need a much larger Navy in blue water platforms especially, and we need to make it urgently. There needs to be a greater budgetary support, not only the Navy, on the entire maritime sector. There is a renewed focus on it. I'm not going to deny that by the present government over the last 9 years, from Sagarmala, infrastructure, both ports and all that. So we have come a long way than what we were a decade ago, but a lot more to be done. I'll stop here.
So, thank you for those very perceptive remarks. I think the Admiral makes a very good point when he says that China is a force to reckon with in the military domain. Today, really in terms of the number of ships, it's the biggest navy in the world. It's overtaken the US. It has a Coast Guard that rivals any other traditional navy. Its Coast Guard has up to 60, more than 60 ships that are more than 2,500 tons. And these ships have all the weaponry that naval ships have. And it has a full-fledged maritime militia. So the Admiral is absolutely right in saying that we should not take the Chinese threat lightly, because this is not just about the Chinese Navy. A lot of our focus is really on the PLAN, the PLA Navy. But really, you also have to be cognizant of the fact that the Chinese have a very strong Coast Guard, and they are more than capable of defending their near seas. And so anything that we plan to do in the South China Sea at the moment, I don't think there's any intention of us going and having a very sort of proactive and aggressive stance in that space. But anything that we choose to do even with our allies, this is a fact that we've got to bear in mind. The Chinese are capable of pushing back. But so I had one question for you before I go to the next speaker, which would be Amrita. So there is the sense that the Chinese seem to have a very sophisticated strategy for the Indian Ocean, which is a little bit different from the strategy that they have for the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, they are aggressive. And as some analysts, the Americans say, this is about full spectrum dominance. This is their rim sea, and they want to dominate that space. But in the Indian Ocean, apparently, there seems to be more of an element of outreach, an element of benevolence, of being a responsible stakeholder. And that makes it very hard for India and some of the other countries that might have some reservations against China operating in the space. It makes it very hard for us to try and counter China through a purely military strategy. And what most analysts also say, that what we need is sort of a more composite plan to push back China, because the Chinese also have the Belt and Road, and they're coming in and they're creating a real urgency for the Chinese Navy to be here as a provider of security. Would you think that these two different strategies pose a challenge to India? How should we go about tackling this issue, this problem?
See, there is no denying that there is a legitimate requirement on the Chinese side for deployment of the navies to protect the sea lines of communications. which crisscross the Indian Ocean region. A very large segment of their trade from east to west transits the Indian Ocean region. They are an energy deficient country, so a lot of oil is imported from the Persian Gulf, which goes past the Indian shores to China. They have the maritime capability to deploy the ships in the Indian Ocean region, and there's very little any nation can deny that as long as they are on the high seas. Okay. What they've been doing in the Indian Ocean, one is they've been systematically surveying the Indian Ocean for the last decade. At any given time, there are 2 to 3 hydrographic vessels which are surveying different segments of the Indian Ocean, and it is all in the high seas. A couple of years back, they entered REZ and they were told to clear off, and the Indian Navy ensured that this happened. They were pushed out. They're saying we are doing normal navigation, but that didn't wash any waters with us. They have invested in port infrastructure. I mean, the most talked about is Hambantota. Okay. That is literally you dig a hole in the ground and make a port. And whatever you may say, there is no economic viability of the Hambantota port in the future. The major container terminals are in Colombo, where very large segment of transshipment of Indian containers take place, almost 70%. And the only use which Hambantota port is being put to, they said it will be used for bunkering of merchant ships going past. That has not happened. So transshipments of cars take place in Hambantota. All cars imported into Sri Lanka come through the port of Hambantota. A very large segment of Hyundai cars manufactured in the Chinese, in the Chennai factory, gets transshipped into car carriers in Hambantota port. So that port, as an economically viable port, is dead. It has no future. It can only be at the cost of Colombo port. They've also invested, they made a major base in Djibouti. It's their first overseas base. They have a jetty which is 335 meters long, which can support their aircraft carrier in the future whenever it deploys to the Indian Ocean region. Now, with a new base of port coming up in Colombo, you have ports on either end. One is on the other side of the Malacca states, the other is here. So they will be here in the Indian Ocean region. We cannot deny that. And you cannot say that they have no legitimate right to be in the Indian Ocean region. There are maritime power, they will be here, they will be deployed on the high seas, and they'll give the reason of protecting their own slots. He can use the same reason to be permanently present in the South China Sea in the high seas. Chinese may claim that it is their internal waters, but that is not as per the UNCLOS. There are like you asked a question on how do you resolve this issue. There are signatories to the UNCLOS, but they don't follow UNCLOS. Unfortunately, the United States follows the UNCLOS regulation, but they are not a signatory to the UNCLOS. Okay, so we have a dilemma. So there have been a dialogue going for a code of conduct for the last 9 years in the South China Sea. Nothing has come about it. And even if you sign a code of conduct, I'm quite sure Chinese will violate the code of conduct. They've done that in the past with the code of conducts they've signed with other nations, including the United States. I'll stop here.
Thank you for that response, sir. I think the Admiral makes a very good point when he says that China has legitimate interests in the Indian Ocean. And this is one of the things that in the maritime discussions in India is not well appreciated, that the Chinese cannot be pushed out of the region because they have legitimate interests in the space. But it's just that the manner of the Chinese expansion, the manner in which they have their footprint is growing in the region, does cause some anxiety about what exactly is the end game as far as the Chinese are concerned. But I'm not going to say very much on this. I'm going to go to Amrita, who's been waiting patiently, and hear her views on what she thinks about the 9-dash line, South China Sea, and also the implications of what is happening in that part of the world for India.
A very good afternoon to all. Thank you very, very much, Chair, for the generous introduction at the beginning. I'm going, a thank you to ORF for having me, and also to my co-panelists who have already set the stage, especially Pooja and Admiral Lamba, by making the claims of China very clear. And as Admiral Lamba has rightly pointed out, the way China has acted upon to secure its claims. Now, I'll take the focus out of China and pitch India's case over here and link it, because it's a national security dialogue, directly to India's national interest. Now, why? At the very outset, I would like to argue that while many in India and for long, we say that South China Sea is not in our immediate interest, but I would like to differ and say that South China Sea is very much now, all the more, in India's primary interest. So that's the benchmark of my argument. And why I say so. Firstly, when we are seeing these tendencies of changing this existing status quo by China through its unilateral activities, and especially in the 10-dash line case, the recent phenomena, it concerns all actors in the Indo-Pacific. So that automatically makes India not an exception, because India is very much a part and a stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific. And this goes back, and here I link it to Abhijit sir's first proposition, that does it impact the balance of power? It very much impacts the balance of power, because it creates a strategic imbalance that threatens the freedom of navigation and resource exploitation by the sovereign actors in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, therefore, what concerns India, being not an exception to this, the growing tensions and this kind of unilateral activities by China has significant ramifications for India. Because South China Sea occupies an important place in India's geographical cartography. The vision has widened now, right? We are talking about Indo-Pacific, no more Asia-Pacific. So within this widened vision, where do we locate India's interest, this national interest? Here, national interest is directly linked to India's maritime interest in the region, which is twofold. Firstly, trade. While now 95% passes of our trade passes through Indian Ocean, 55% is through the South China Sea. So that makes us a direct, it has direct implications for India if anything happens in South China Sea. Now, narrowing down further, where is the trade? Our trade with India, with ASEAN itself, which is approximately 11% of India's total trade, which is quite a number. India's export to ASEAN stands at around roughly 12% of total exports. And investment flows from ASEAN has also increased, which is standing at roughly 18 to 19%. So doesn't that make a stronger case for India, because there is a common interest? Now, taking it, extending the envelope further, India's trade with Japan and South Korea is also in this ambit when I'm talking about the trade faction, because with Japan, we have roughly over 22 odd billion trade, and with South Korea around roughly 24 odd billion trade. So this brings it connects ASEAN, the entire Southeast Asia, plus select countries, that is Japan and South Korea in Northeast Asia, to India's national interest, especially from the trade perspective. And this has direct implications for, or direct connect to, India's Act East policy, because trade is a big factor. So as India's trade and investments increases with ASEAN state, it automatically translates into a collective interest. So if you have that collective interest in mind, making China's actions in South China Sea, this makes China's actions in South China Sea more significant, if not less, for India. Now, taking from the trade factor, the other national interest of India is linked to procurement of energy supplies, given its energy needs, which is crucial for growth and development. Now, we see India's energy basket has increased, that India has diversified its supply chain, and is, as a result, almost 70% of its oil imports are shipped, again, seaborne. So this further validates India's interest, or rather direct interest, in South China Sea, because the trade route and the energy route is almost similar in this way because it's coming from the Gulf. Now, like further extending, sorry, from ASEAN now to the Gulf when I'm talking about energy. Now, apart from this, India, what is crucial is India in securing its energy interest is also involved in activities on the margins of the South China Sea, which goes directly in contrast or clashes with China's interest. As you are aware of, ONGC Videsh is involved in oil and gas exploration with Vietnam's Petro-Vietnam in the offshore blocks, where one of that is Block 128, which is directly situated in the South China Sea's disputed waters, and which are believed that China believes that it's part of China's exclusive economic zone. Now that this has created a contention between India and China, and I would like to draw from in 2015, China had warned India, stating, as I quote, that any oil and gas exploration work should get approval first from China. So this is a direct warning to India, not to Vietnam. So there again, he pitches that my case strong that why India is a direct stakeholder. And this year we see that India has got its 8th extension in oil exploration in Vietnam. And in the other block, this is block 06.1, India literally has 45% of stakes in it. So it's quite a huge number. So with these strategic interests, India has increasingly, we see that has become vocal over time in pitching forward or putting forward its case in terms of resolution of the dispute. It is not taking, a bystander position. It has become vocal over time, and it is, as MEA has rightly pointed out that, or rightly stated, that India supports freedom of navigation and overflight and unimpeded commerce based on the principles of international law. So that commerce, unimpeded commerce, as I quote MEA over here, so it puts forward that India is very much looking, watching, and is, calculating what can be China's actions and which can be at odds with India's interests in the South China Sea. So therefore, in this regard, when it comes to international law, this brings in the other point of contention between India and China, because India's position on international law runs contrary to Beijing's interests. And this further makes South China Sea yet another bone of contention between the two countries. And we know that, we are working with the United States, as earlier we had signed a joint strategic vision, then called Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean region. So we are joining hands with our friendly foreign and allies with activities related to South China Sea. As I would like to argue that a stable South China Sea is very important for India's Act East policy. We cannot have instability in that region. And for that, India is coordinating with countries in the region. And in doing so, this is where I would like to throw some criticality. In doing so, India is challenging, or rather posing a counter challenge to China's increasing footprints in India's strategic backyard in Indian Ocean. So South China Sea becomes, a yard where India can give a tough battle to China. This also brings in major, competition, power rivalry, in the discourse. So India's rising interest in South China Sea may be interpreted as a response to the China challenge in its own region, that is Indian Ocean. So on that note, I would like to end with one linkage that is adding to what both Pooja and Admiral Lanba said, that it's lawfare, it's psychological warfare, but I would like to add another angle to it. Releasing of maps is also part of a tactic used in building your discourse power, which China is doing so. China now is in the quest of building itself as a discursive power. strengthening the narratives, telling the China story well. How do you do that? And I think so on that note, I will leave it to it. Open to your comments, suggestions, and questions.
Thank you, Amrita, for those very interesting insights. I think you've underscored India's interest in the South China Sea quite clearly. You're absolutely right when you say we have energy interests, we have trade interests, more than 55% of our trade passes through that region. There's the Act East policy. And there's also, to boot, we have the whole Sagar strategy, security and growth for all. And as per that strategy, we see ourselves as security providers in the region, favored security partners. And we just don't want to limit this to the Indian Ocean. We would also like to be a capacity builder and a security provider for Southeast Asia, and we are doing that. But I have one question to you before I go to Colin, Amrita, which is that, there's no denying that we have interests and that we're more active than we were in the past. But we are not quite a security player in the South China Sea. I mean, it was last week that the Philippines, the US, Australia, and Japan, I mean, all of our Quad partners were all doing a big military exercise in the West Philippine Sea as a way of posturing to China to tell it that what it was doing in Taiwan was completely unacceptable. Look at Japan, that's had a similar stance as far as the South China Sea is concerned as India about a few years ago. But now they realize that they've got to do more than just capacity building in the regions. And so they're taking a much more assertive stand. They're standing in their ships to do exercises in regions that are close to the disputed waters. And that sort of sends a message to China. Of course, China's relationships with India and Japan are quite different. There is an element of animosity, but you could not say that China treats both countries similarly. I'm not making the case that we should be Japan, but I'm saying that what's your understanding of where we should draw the line as far as operations, hard operations in the South China Sea are concerned? Do you think there is a need for us to go beyond just saying that we need, unimpeded commerce and freedom of navigation, and all of that is just water off a duck's back as far as China is concerned? I mean, they're listening to this rhetoric for a long period of time. If we've got to send the message to China that if it can be active in the Indian Ocean and create apprehension for us, we can be active in the South China Sea and create a certain fear in the Chinese mind, where do you think we should draw that line?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I think so. Firstly, we need to give away that mindset that, distance makes us secure. Geography, that's it. Because the Russia-Ukraine conflict proved to us that, if anything happens in any part of the world today, you get impacted directly, rather not indirectly. So my case was to build that notion that India needs to think that now we need to take a position as direct stakeholders in this, let's say, global commons is the word I will like to use. And we need to expedite. How do you do that? By having your power projection. China does that with its power projection. It aids that through various mechanisms. Now, yes, good you pointed out that, when we reiterate, they only become rhetoric. Statements become rhetoric, and actions speak louder than words, and China actually understands with actions. Well, for us, we need to firstly expedite our relations with our friendly foreign countries in Southeast Asia. Ramp up our military exercises, what just not like single-handedly, but when you're having, two is always better. It strengthens. Why I'm saying so, there's also a thing that when China put forward the map, everyone who's in dispute with China, it's unanimous. Everyone is feeling that same emotion. The ASEAN states were in dispute, and India specifically with its land border. So there is a consensus. We need to expedite on this common emotion that we feel, and India needs to pitch its case strong as a strong stakeholder in South China Sea, as China does in Indian Ocean. So it's only tit for tat. So it only comes with power and power demonstration. There is no other way to do that.
Amrita, you make a good point by saying that power speaks louder than words. So power projection is the way to go. I'm not going to come to Colin. Colin, I know we are pushing you. You're joining us from Amsterdam, and I believe your flight landed just 2 or 3 hours back. So thank you so much. But I'd like to let the people in the room know that Colin is one of the most avid, followers of maritime security affairs, particularly in the Pacific, and he has a very active Twitter account that some of us follow to know what's happening in that part of the world. So Colin, you're a man with the ear to the ground. Tell us about what you think about about this new map and the disputes in the region.
I think over here is afternoon. So good afternoon to all of you. Abhijit, thanks so much for having me with you. ORF, I'm very greatly indebted for the opportunity to join this discussion. It's very timely. And I also would refer all of you to a very recent piece that I've written on these very topic on the 10-dash line. So it is published with the Channel News Asia. So you could just probably Google my name and you type CNA, and then the piece will come out. So you'll read that, and I welcome you to give any comments and honestly critique it. So my presentation is going to touch a little on it. But as you know, I could not write everything down in a 1,000-word commentary. So I will use this opportunity to share a bit more of what I know about this 10-dash line. Now, I'll jump straight into it. I have only, say, 7 minutes left, so I will be very quick on that. Now, the 10-dash line is not new. If you look at the Ministry of Natural Resources, you will find that there had been versions of maps being released over the many years. The most commonly used map that dated first released in 2016, and thereafter, almost on an annual basis, they will publish variations of it, already featured a 10-dash to the east of Taiwan. So that is actually not new. I mean, the media tries to hype up as if it's a new thing. It's not new. The only thing is the circumstance to which this particular development, which obviously the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I mean, they are partly right when they are trying to state it as a fact that, we have been doing that routinely. Yeah, on this point, they are correct. The question is, why the hype this time? Now, it all probably started with Global Times, and I think many of you read Global Times. Sometimes you'll be amused by what they are writing about. Sometimes you get very angry what they are writing about. It is a jingoistic, hyper-nationalistic tabloid that is linked to the ruling Communist Party of China. Some of you may dismiss it as, it's just simply another tabloid, so don't pay attention to it. Now, I do know what exactly it's all about. I have people who are in the know in China telling me that there are people who work for the government agencies who write with Global Times, not with their real name, but they put pen names into it. From time to time, Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other ministry people in China will so-called rehash Global Times articles. They share them and they comment on them. So in a way, you can't say that it is completely divorced from the real policy making in China. What I could say is that it is part of the entire ecosystem of the discourse shaping community in China itself. Now, so when Global Times published this as an exclusive about the 10-dash line, the very greatest likelihood is that it has been queued to do that, rather than very likely they post somebody who is monitoring the ministry website on a daily basis and sort of push it out. Normally, when they publish a new map, it will come along with a press release simply to tell everyone, both domestic and international users, that a new map is published, so please go and use it because it's the most updated. It is very routine. It is almost very technical. The fact that Global Times is very likely chosen by certain powers that be in Beijing to amplify it is simply to send out a strong signal. The strong signal that came not long before the ASEAN summit took place, and of course the G20 summit that recently took place in New Delhi. So generally, it's meant to send a signal that China isn't going to compromise on those claims. And of course, you could include Russia into the picture, you include Nepal into the picture. Now, there are a few things that we can draw out that I just debunked the so-called hype around the 10-dash line. It doesn't really change the very basis of it. The two observations that I have to that before I go down into looking at Southeast Asia and thereafter will be, first is that the whole significance of having a 10-dash line to the east of Taiwan is simply to remind all of us. I don't think that is what Beijing wants to remind us about, but I think we have to remind ourselves that if you want to look at Taiwan, for example, as a separate theater from the South China Sea, it is not possible. In other words, any conflict that takes place around Taiwan will necessarily have to include the South China Sea as part of the entire theater of operations. You can't divorce that. So the Taiwan and the South China Sea is so interlinked because the South China Sea is the southern flank of any such operations against Taiwan that will be initiated by the People's Republic of China. So that is one reminder that we ought to have. Second is that notwithstanding what happened right after the release of the arbitral award back in July 2016 that practically invalidated China's claims in the South China Sea, I think there are some hype, that came about after that, talking about China having abandoned the 9-dash line and then has now relied on what they call the 4 shars theory. The 4 shars implying the 4 archipelagic clusters within the South China Sea. We will be the Paracels, the Spratleys, Macclesfield Bank, as well as Pratas Island. So these 4 archipelagic clusters were thought to be the basis of that claim. So if anything, these maps clearly show that this has not gone away. It still remains the very same claim that we have been always talking about. Now, on the history of it, now, I think it is important when I talk on sharing more of the Southeast Asia perspective, is that this is not exactly something very new, because the media also hyped that, Southeast Asian countries responded in an unprecedented manner. Yes, granted, there are 5 of these ASEAN parties in the South China Sea dispute that had released statements that explicitly or implicitly responded to China's so-called 10-dash line map. But if you think of has also been such a precedent. China, in that context, early 2020 was COVID-19 outbreak, and China was particularly abrasive towards its Southeast Asian rivals in the South China Sea. So during then, there were a spate of incidents that took place one after another. So we, of course, start off with the pre-pandemic was with Vietnam, and then with the North Natuna Sea with Indonesia, and then with the West Capella oil drilling platform with Malaysia, and then into 2021 was Whitsun Reef with the Philippines. Now, throughout all these, the one common thread was that a number of countries in Southeast Asia responded rather vigorously. They issued note verbal to the UN to denounce China's South China Sea claims. So this is something that has happened before. It is not so much something that we should hype about in the South China Sea, but the bigger issue here is that in general, I think the context now is very different, because if you cast the pandemic situation back in 2020 aside, right now in China, a spate of domestic problems created greater uncertainty. Now, I mean, you have been very much aware about the disappearances of key high-level officials in China, Qin Gang, and then of course now Li Shangfu, and even in between them there are some lower-level high-ranking officials who also were indicted somehow for certain unspecified crimes or wrongdoings. So now China is mired in rather unprecedented domestic problems, not just politically, but I think more importantly is the economic dimension of it. The property sector problems, shadow banking problems, high youth unemployment, sluggish exports. We are looking at China going on a trajectory that doesn't appear to be very assuring to every one of us. Now, we are not going to think about a sort of a double-digit growth going forward a slowdown in China's economy is in the works, and there is a high likelihood that it will have great implications on its external policy. The concern here is that authoritarian regimes that are now faced with domestic problems may tend to externalize those problems. And in the case of China, it would be the CCP and Xi Jinping who are possibly externalizing those problems by doing something adventurous in the South China Sea, or even with Taiwan, for example. It might, I'm not trying to overblow it, but there is this possibility we have to bear in mind. So with that, it was interesting to see that ASEAN is not exactly doing things very differently, honestly. I mean, some of the commentators out there were hoping that ASEAN for once will be doing something precisely different. Not really. ASEAN as an institution isn't exactly doing anything different, because other than the South China Sea is grappling with Myanmar issue. And down to the individual ASEAN member states, I think in general, we see a common thread amongst them. There's a desire to balance interests. Those interests would be the South China Sea interests, and of course, to manage them with their views of broader ties with China. Malaysia, Indonesia have come out to say quite openly that they don't view the South China Sea as the sort of most important part that defines their broader relationship with China. So this is likely going to remain the case. Reason being that these countries in Southeast Asia are not exactly also having the best of times after COVID-19 and with the war in Ukraine, with food, energy security, inflation, and all that. There's always been a desire to try to get their economies back on track. And because of that, foreign policy is the last thing they want to have to sort of derail all their effort. So in that account, they will desire to maintain buoyant relationship with China. But that doesn't mean they are being ruled over by China. So what we see here is a slew of efforts that we have not been very alien to. They have been very familiar to us. Self-help is one aspect. They try to build up their maritime forces to try to match up with what China may have thrown towards them. But as you know, all of them are smaller and weaker parties in the South China Sea, so there is a clear limitation. And with current fiscal constraints, it is even more difficult. So with that, it actually means that there is now a greater currency to engage like-minded and friendly extra-regional parties in the South China Sea, as we have seen in the case of Indonesia conducting the recent exercise with the US, Australia, Japan in exercise Super Garuda Shield, as well as a host of other exercises around the region, especially those concerning the Philippines with Australia recently. This trend is going forward in so much because there is a clear recognition that internally there is very limited things that Southeast Asian countries can do in the South China Sea, so they require extra regional parties to come in to give some help. So with that, in fact, I wasn't that exactly worried about whether or not India will have a position within the South China Sea. There's always going to be room for India. The only question that I believe a number of countries in the region, which by that I mean ASEAN member states, will have is how engaged will India be? That's one. And of course, there is another thing about having to satisfy a very difficult client is that the client wants you to be here, but the client tries to define parameters for you to be there. So to what extent India will contribute to South China Sea as a stakeholder, to the extent to which it doesn't unnecessarily worry Southeast Asian countries that there could be a potential clash with China, for example. So it is very tough questions to manage, and I don't think India is alone. This is a question that the US is confronted with, our European friends are confronted with, even Japan is confronted with. So I think that's something that we need to discuss about after that. So with that, Abhijit, thanks so much. I apologize if I exceeded the time. I apologize again for coming in late.
Thank you, Colin, for those very useful remarks. I think you make a plausible observation when you say that there might have been an element of hype in this whole 10-dash line, and that it's not unprecedented. The Chinese have in the past come up with it. But I'm actually tempted to ask you a sort of short question before I go to our last speaker, Commodore Anil Jaising, which is that, Colin, are we are we witnessing a breakdown of deterrence in Southeast Asia? And the reason I ask you this is that you brought up Taiwan, and I completely agree with you that a lot of this might have to do with what's happening in the waters of Taiwan. And we know that there have been a number of over 100 air incursions just in the past week or 10 days, and all from China. And if you look at the Chinese activities, not just close to Taiwan, but there was the water cannon incident that happened, near Second Thomas Shoal, close to the Philippines. There is the Chinese exercise that has happened in the East Philippine Sea, close to Guam. And if you look at the Americans and the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Australians, they're doing these island capture exercises. You just get a sense that everyone's getting too aggressive. And that means that deterrence seems to be breaking down. Is China being pushed into a corner? And do you think that the outcome of this strategy might actually be adverse if cooler heads don't prevail? I mean, this is just a thought, but I would like your views on this.
Okay, Abhijit, thanks so much. It's a very great question. I wouldn't agree that there's a breakdown in deterrence, but I will argue that deterrence is under strain for sure. It's not being broken down. As far as China is concerned, the water cannon incident was not unprecedented. If you think about it, in 2021, that was back then, much better days between the Philippines and China, and that was under Duterte. It was kind of interesting to me as well back then, because when I was observing this entire saga, I was thinking that, with the water cannon, effectively, the water cannon blows away the poster boy, who is Duterte. He is supposed to be the poster boy of, so-called new age relationship between China and Southeast Asia. He was supposed to be upheld as that particular poster boy. And why would you want to go around and offend your poster boy, right? I mean, in a way, it probably doesn't really matter to the ruling CCP or Xi Jinping himself, because ultimately, those national interests that are at stake are more important than just simply maintaining certain friendships with what they may tend to see to be rather mercurial leadership running certain Southeast Asian countries. So that water cannon incident wasn't new, but it does amply show us that, in a way, China is now in a very comfortable position in the South China Sea compared to many years ago. We are talking about pre-2014, in fact. 2014 was around the time when all the revelations about the artificial islands came about. So it has been, so many years since, almost coming close to a full decade. China is in a very comfortable position. My discussion with interlocutors in China turned away quite interesting observation. I mean, they were saying that, we are now in a much better position. We are able to control and observe what we need to see and what we need to do in our near seas. And by near seas, they are referring to the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea. These are waters that are so immediately adjacent to the mainland. So these are areas where they have already reached a certain level of comfort in terms of maritime domain awareness, in terms of striking capabilities. They have all that covered. So they are in a position that doesn't require them to do that much, really. I mean, they may not have to resort to very drastic actions. What they need to do is gradually they will use other forms of instruments in their repertoire to try to wear down their opponents. And by opponents, I will refer to Taiwan, the various Southeast Asian rivals in the South China Sea, and even extra-regional powers like the US. So gradually, the whole idea to convey is that China is the resident staying power. It can play the long game. It doesn't have to do water cannoning every day. It does that as and when it becomes necessary to do so. So with that, I don't think there is a sort of breakdown in deterrence, because, when the Americans came in to help the Filipinos with the second attempt to Second Thomas Shoal, the Chinese did not go further. They, in fact, decided that, it doesn't pay off to go forward and thereby potentially galvanize the other regional countries to its detriment. So it seemed to be aware that the line is there and the line shouldn't be crossed somewhat. But it is cold comfort because, who knows, domestically, there could be pressures to go beyond that. So we are, in fact, gambling with the chances. But that doesn't mean that deterrence has broken down. But if we have seen across the region, that deterrence now has increasingly come under strain, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. And last but not the least, Kamaru Vijay Singh, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Abhijit and the ORF for giving me this opportunity to be here this afternoon in the midst of so many experts. After hearing these 4 fantastic presentations, there doesn't seem to be very much left to be said after we're just talking about a dash. But the fact that we're still discussing it means it's more than a dash. It's the 10th dash that we're talking about. So I'll keep my remarks. Most of what I thought I'd speak about has already been said expectedly. So I'll just keep my remarks very short and look forward to the discussion thereafter. The standard map has raised hackles across the length and breadth of the region. India lodged a strong protest, and that seemed to encourage the Southeast Asian nations to do likewise. While India's strong protest may not have surprised the Chinese, which they would have expected, perhaps the reaction from the Southeast Asian nations may have taken China by some surprise. China, as expected, reacted or did not react, was indifferent to this protest. The Chinese foreign ministry spokesman, in fact, went on national press to say that he didn't understand what the fuss was all about. And of course, our external affairs minister said it's just something that, the situation on the ground doesn't change. But the point I'd like to make here is that, and this is not necessarily for the dash, it's about the map. I think it's time, the countries that get affected by these kind of Chinese cartographic incursions or intrusions into other sovereign territories needs a stronger reaction. China expects there will be a protest. China doesn't bother about it. It slowly becomes a new normal. Future generations of Chinese children are going to grow up thinking this is China. In 20 years from now, they'll grow up thinking this is China and we've intruded into their territory rather than the other way around. That is something I think we really need to address. For China, I personally believe face is very important. They want to be seen as a superior sort of power, everyone deferential to it. So perhaps, I don't know, there are lots of maybe diplomats here who can clarify this after this. But why did we just lodge a strong protest? Why did we not summon the Chinese ambassador and give him a good talking to? And make sure that this gets projected in the international media? That would have been loss of face for China. China would have been smarting from that, but they would probably have thought twice before doing it the next time. China always respects power. We've seen that over the years. Whenever we've stood up to China, they've backed down. Whereas when you've just sort of let it pass, we've ended up in a bit of a mess. And that's why I think, as has come out in various presentations, the armed forces, at least in India, are very suspicious of Chinese motives. Though a lot of other people, kind of attributed to, oh, well, they're doing it, they don't mean it, they're fine, they're very kind, But that's not true. After all, they had promised they will not militarize the islands. That's what they promised the US, and look what they've done with them. So I think that's one thing we need to understand about China, which is very important. And that is why I'm a little surprised that despite 4 Southeast Asian nations or ASEAN nations having expressed their disappointment or their protest, the ASEAN summit that followed found very little mention of this. Indonesia, as the chair, the largest ASEAN power, so strategically located across the expanse of the South China Sea and the gateway and the access to the Indian Ocean, I thought should have at least made a mention, strong mention of this, but it found no mention. So this map was released at the timing was no coincidence. It followed BRICS and was before the G20 and the ASEAN summits. And both of them Xi Jinping did not attend. So it wasn't just a coincidence that happened. And that is why this protest should have come at both the G20 summit as well as the ASEAN summit, but it didn't. Anyway, be that as it may, it is obviously a conscious decision by China to reshape the geographic contours of the region. There is no doubt about that. And as I said, this will become the new normal. We need to worry about it. As has been explained, this gives China more than 90% ownership of the South China Sea. It reinforces its claim, which the PCA had kind of debunked and said there is no legitimate claim to the 9-dash line. So by establishing a 10th dash, they're sort of reinforcing their point that it is ours and it does belong to us, and we'll even expand if required. And it expands, not only does it east of Taiwan, but it also extends it northwards. So we don't know what is the subsequent 11th dash going to be whenever it happens. Because China has now started claiming parts of the northern part of Russia, right up to Vladivostok. So what exactly is the larger strategic intent with this, this sort of creep that's happening into Indian territory, into Russian territory, along the South China Sea? We need to watch this very carefully. I'll just cover 3 points. One is, what are the implications of this 10-dash line? Firstly, for global trade or for the world in general, for India, and how are we going to address this? Admiral Lanba has given us a fantastic exposition on the Chinese, on the PLA Navy, its likely intentions, its weaknesses, our own reactions, our own responses. So I think I was going to cover that, but I'll cut it short and just mention a few points. There is tremendous amount of implication of this 10-dash line or whatever this entire area for global trade. 60% of the global GDP is generated in this region. 60% of the world's population lives here, a little more than that. And that is why it has led many of the so-called Eurocentric nations like the Netherlands and Germany also to articulate Indo-Pacific strategies. The EOs come out as an Indo-Pacific strategy because their economic well-being in the future also depends on this region and ensuring safe and secure trade, protection of slogs, and respecting the global commons and the rules-based order. As far as India is concerned, as has been brought out, 55% of India's trade flows eastwards, and a large part of it goes through the South China Sea. We are looking at increasing our connectivity. We are talking about the Chennai-Vladivostok Maritime Corridor that's going to pass through the center of the South China Sea. So what we have to guard against, of course, is that our slogs are protected, our trade is not affected, and we don't end up with a South China Sea dilemma that we so proudly claim about the Malacca dilemma for the Chinese. It could well become a South China Sea dilemma for India after some time, if we are not able to get our act together. How do we do that? It has come out that we are a powerful navy, we are the preeminent naval power in the Indian Ocean, but we probably still lack the capacities to take on the PLA Navy in their waters, in the South China Sea. So what do? We have seen a lot of like-minded navies getting together over the last few years. Quad is one, the Malabar is one. Recently, the ASEAN navies exercised together for the first time, a major exercise. So we do see that like-minded navies are sort of getting together, improving their interoperability, getting to understand each other's concerns, and perhaps over a period of time will be able to support each other through information sharing, through maritime domain awareness, through coordinated and joint patrols towards containing the Chinese maritime or naval threat in the future. Maybe, if you remember in the 90s, Admiral Mike Mullen, a former CNO of the US Navy, had talked about a 1,000-ship navy, which wasn't about 1,000 warships. It was a figurative, he just figuratively spoke about all the navies getting together to have a common sort of goal of ensuring maritime security in the region. So maybe we're looking at something like that in the future. But that I'll leave to the discussion subsequently. China's, the PLA Navy, as Admiral Lanba said, its focus right now is making the first and second island chains impregnable. They're focusing all their attention on the first and second island chain, whether it's their A2AD strategy, whether it's the carrier killer missiles, their great undersea wall, their aircraft carrier deployments. Their aircraft carriers haven't yet gone. They've got 2 aircraft carriers. They've got SSNs, but the aircraft carriers have still not exited the second island chain. They never come out into the open ocean. They haven't come to the Indian Ocean. They will eventually, we have no doubt about that, but not yet. So obviously, they are still not operating to their full potential, and there are various reasons for that. They have the largest navy in the world, 350 ships, again, as Admiral Lanba said, intending to be a 450-ship navy by 2030, with 1/3 of it being blue water capable. But do they have the confidence right now to operate as a blue water navy in its far seas on a sustained power projection kind of trajectory? I don't think so, not yet. They'll come with ships, their ships will come, their ships will go all the way to the Mediterranean, Atlantic, everywhere. But whether they can sort of sustain that presence right now, do they have the confidence to do that with the carrier battle groups? I'm not so sure. But 2030 could be a whole different ballgame. They'll have 3 or 4 carriers by then. They'll have learned carrier operations. They're already exercising extensively in their own waters. Their 6 present SSNs are expected to increase to 12 to 15 by 2030. They will definitely have an SSN presence in the Indian Ocean. Admiral Lanba spoke a lot about Djibouti. Djibouti is at the other extremity of the Indian Ocean. They are going to base their carrier there. Their carriers will visit there. But what worries me more, and as Abhijit had brought out, I think that the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal are really the areas of concern because they sort of provide this connectivity between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And the recent commissioning of the BNA Sheikh Hasina, a submarine base in Bangladesh, is, I think, of greater concern to India than all these things put together. The base is going to cater for 6 submarines and 8 warships. Bangladesh right now has 2 40-year-old submarines. They don't need a base for that. It's a Chinese-built base. It is going to support Chinese submarines in the future that come into the Bay of Bengal. I am in no doubt about that. They've given a submarine to Myanmar. They've given submarines to Thailand. In all these places, they're going to provide support facilities, maintenance facilities, training, operating support. All of it will be Chinese. There'll be a Chinese presence over there. And this will be a place where future Chinese submarines will come and berth and then operate in the Bay of Bengal. And that is something that should concern us because so far we've taken the Bay of Bengal somewhat for granted that there really is nobody to challenge the Indian Navy in the Bay of Bengal. We've had a border standoff with China for 3 years now, more than 3 years. But despite all the tension along that 4,000-kilometer line of actual control, the disputed line of actual control, the PLA Navy has steered clear of the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. We haven't heard of a single incident where the PLA Navy has come into contact with the Indian Navy because PLA Navy clearly understands its limitations in the Indian Ocean. It is not in a position to take on the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean for at least a decade or more. And that is why they've kept their distance. So what I'm trying to say is that they understand their limitations and they're doing everything possible to address those. While they don't have a powerful enough presence, they're building a base structure. Djibouti, Gwadar, probably Gamban may become a naval base, I don't know. BNA Sheikh Hasina, Myanmar. So they are going to have a network of bases and ports which will support their future naval presence in the Indian Ocean, even though they don't have as many ships here at the moment. I think India, as Abhijit brought out and as Admiral Lamba brought out, I think Sagar is a fantastic initiative, this security and growth for all in the region. India is doing a lot of capacity building in its own way. And I think the fundamental difference between our capacity building and their capacity building is we are inclusive, we are cooperative, and we understand the sensitivities of the people we are doing our capacity building with, and not just riding roughshod over them. The recent sale of BrahMos was mentioned, giving of Kirpan to Vietnam was mentioned, INS Kirpan gifted to Vietnam. We gave a kilo-class submarine to Myanmar. Now, a submarine being given from one country to another is the absolute pinnacle of defense diplomacy and defense cooperation that you can have. And we gave one of our operational submarines to Myanmar. That counts for a lot, in terms of the outreach, military diplomacy outreach that India has been doing over the last few years and building capacity in the region. All this should stand us in good stead in the future, hopefully. We also need to address some of our own I won't call them capability deficits, but we certainly need to build capacity and capability. The 3rd aircraft carrier we keep hearing about. We need nuclear attack submarines to check the Chinese aircraft carrier presence in the Indian Ocean when it comes. We need expeditionary capability if we are going to be looking at a large geographical area where India may need to intervene at some point of time. We recently heard that we will have a 175-ship Navy by 2032. Unfortunately, these goalposts are shifting. A few years ago, it was 175 ships by 2027. It seems to have slipped to 2032. We do have limitations in our shipbuilding capacity in the country, but we are trying to address all those, I think, and we're moving on the right track. We probably need to do it a little faster. So I think from that perspective, for India, the 10-dash line is not something that we can wish away, or like Amrita said, it's geographically too far, so we shouldn't worry about it. It's something we need to worry about because all these things are interlinked. It's part of a larger sort of strategic region, and whatever happens in one part of it is going to impact the other. China will, of course, constantly attempt to change the status quo that they always do. They are going to do that. So far, we have protested, but not adequately enough, and we have allowed things to drift, which we should not. And this obviously has emboldened China and allowed it to establish, well, the new normal, if one may call it. It's done it along the border. The salami slicing along the border is well known. It has shown its lack of regard for all international conventions so far. So one can't count on, invoking those kind of things and trying to drive China down a guilty path. They're never guilty of anything. Everybody else is guilty of everything vis-a-vis them. And it is determined to reorient the rules-based order. It wants to be the dominant global maritime power because that's how it's going to achieve its aspiration of being the global numero uno. And if it has to be the global dominant maritime power, it is going to reorient the rules-based order into one with what I call Chinese characteristics. Do we really want that to happen? I'm sure we don't, because we know what that means. We've seen what that means in the South China Sea, and we can't allow that to happen in the entire region or across the world. So I think we need to keep that in mind, and that probably is a thought I will end with and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So thank you, sir. That was terrific. I think that there's two standout observations that you made for me. One is that China still lacks the confidence and the experience, maybe if not the capability of being a long-term player in the Indian Ocean. But I tell you, they are getting there. If you look at the Chinese, if you look at the fact that the Chinese Shandong, which is the second aircraft carrier, has been involved in more than 2 or 3 deployments close to Guam, it means they're actually breaking out of the first island chain. And if they can do it in the Pacific, they can certainly do it in the Indian Ocean. So we should not be complacent, but I agree with sir, it's going to take a while for the Chinese to sort of earn their spurs in the Indian Ocean. The second standout comment for me, and I completely agree with you, is that there's a different sort of, and these are just my words, the way I look at it, is different sort of salami slicing that's happening in the Indian Ocean, very different from what's happening in the South China Sea, where it's about territory. When sir talks about the Sheikh Hasina, the bases are coming up in Hambantota, Cambodia, all of that, it tells you that the Chinese have thought of a different way to shave off Indian influence in this region. And that is to build these dual use ports. And I think going forward, I'm not sure China will need a full-fledged military strategy to deal with India. If they have a very sound developmental strategy, they marry that up with some kind of a defense strategy or a maritime strategy, maybe that will deliver the goods for them. I'm not sure, but it's possible. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. And as you gather your thoughts, I'm going to just make one. Yeah, certainly. I'm just going to make one observation, which is that the PCA ruling comes up for, this is something that should have been sort of said earlier, always comes up for discussion, which is in 2016, the arbitral tribunal actually rejected some of China's claims. The Philippines had taken them to court, and the court said that their claims weren't valid. But the real issue is this, that wasn't really a territorial claim that the PC had rejected. And there is a misunderstanding that China's territorial claims are actually being rejected by the UN court. That's not true. The fact is that this was dressed as a clarification of a principle in law to say that could China's 9-dash line be a basis to advance historical claims in the region? And the PCA said no, it cannot be used as and the historical claims being fishing rights, other rights, drilling, etc. The Chinese said we've been doing fishing for for 1,000,000 years, for 1,000 years. So the court said no, that's certainly not acceptable. The second important thing, and this is again the intelligence part of the Filipinos, is that they sought a clarification on the status of the features. Were they islands? And the reason they asked that, if they were islands, then they generated a territorial sea and they generated an EEZ. But the court said no, they're not they're just rocks. And if they are just rocks, that means that all of China's claims in the region are in some ways invalidated. So one of the reasons why China is also so aggressive in these waters is that they feel that the Philippines was smart. It slyly brought up an issue which was actually a territorial dispute, but dressed it in a way as if it sounded like a clarification of a point in law, and now their claims have been invalidated. I suspect that may be one reason why the Chinese are acting so aggressively. But I'm going to now open this up, and Ajay, since you got my attention first, the first question is to you.
Thanks, Abhijit. Good afternoon, Admiral Lamba. Ajay Banerjee this side. My question is on a very narrow question to Admiral Lamba or Commodore Jai Singh. Either of you can answer. I come from I'm trying to understand this construct of the Quad first, and also the talk which you have made. Will, in case of specifically with India and China, will any of our partners who are our partners in Quad or elsewhere, will they be with us in case of a boots of ground situation? Will they be with us in case China has an adversarial relationship with India in the Indian Ocean? Are we alone, or are the partners with us? Admiral Lamba or Jai Singh, sir? Anyone?
Admiral sir, can you take this question?
Sure. Unlikely. You have to fight your own fight. Okay. Nobody's going to come and hold your hand in case there is a shooting war and a clash at sea. Okay. You may be provided support in the form like what happened, intelligence sharing, development of MDA both on the surface and underwater. But actual platforms and boots on ground fighting is we'll have to do it ourselves. Okay. I hope, Banerjee, I've answered your question in short and sweet.
I fully agree with Admiral Lamba. I think you have to fight your own battles. Nobody's going to come and fight a battle with us. There will be other means maybe in which we'll get the support, MDA, information sharing, intelligence sharing. But certainly, when it comes to conflict, we're going to fight our own battles, and so is everybody else. We are not allies of anybody. We are not military allies. So that's an important factor.
True. No, but I actually think that there's pressure on us to fight somebody else's battle. Because there's so much happening in the Pacific. There's almost an expectation that India is going to take part in what's happening on Taiwan. So I think that's something that we should be talking about. I mean, I don't have an opinion on that, but the second question would be from, yes, please.
Hi, sir. This is Manu Pabi from Economic Times. Abhijit, very good panel. All speakers, very interesting thoughts. So my question is, it is understood, everyone said, that India is trying its way to counter China in many, many ways, which is putting up allies, increasing capabilities. And I think both Admiral and Sir, you touched upon the need for more capacity building. Is there an understanding within the senior leadership of the country that there needs to be more spending on naval? And the Navy has been making the case. They have been making a case for many, many more platforms, more capabilities. But over the years, evidently from the budgetary allocation, it's clear it's not been really translating to the kind of effort that is required. So do you think the message is clear with the top leadership? And in terms of capability, what are the priority areas, if you could touch upon, which we will need in the coming decades to counter China, not only here, but also perhaps in the South China Sea?
Excellent question. I would go to Admiral Lamba, and I'll also come to you, sir, after this. Sir, would you answer this question on capabilities?
So in 2012, the Navy share of the budget had gradually risen to 18% of the defense budget. And thereafter, it started to fall. And systematically, Navy took it up year on year with the government of India, saying that we need at least 18 to 20% of the share of the defense budget. Okay. It fell, came down to 13% till 2000, I think if my memory is correct, 17, while finally in 2018, there was a gradual increase in the share of the defense budget when it went close to 14%. Okay. There is no doubt that the Navy or the maritime capability development in the country needs to be better funded. Okay. There are challenges in capability development across the board for all the three services. New methods are being tried out. I have my own opinion on the Agniveer scheme. I'm not going to go down that road. It's not part of this panel. Okay, but without a doubt, we need to spend more money on maritime capability development. Unfortunately, AJ spoke on the long-term perspective plan of 175 ship Navy. The 2012 plan talked of a 200 ship Navy in 15 years time to 2027. Okay, we are nowhere near that. We need to, the whole system needs to be more outcome oriented than be too worried about the processes to be followed for capability development. I'm talking of the whole process of sanction of a particular project. It takes far too long. Our shipyard productivity has improved with modernization, with money has been invested, especially in the DPSUs and the Cochin shipyard by the Indian Navy themselves. Okay, productivity for destroyers have come down to 8 years. We need to bring it down to less than 5, and we need to have projects in series production. Okay, we have done some work in Project 17 and Project 15 and all that were series production. But there is without a doubt, if you want to be counted as a regional provider and a provider of security in the Indo-Pacific, it has to be on the back of maritime power. And if you're going to neglect maritime power, you can develop your army and the air force to whatever levels you want, but you're not going to be counted as a regional power because they're going to be limited to your territory and territorial borders only. You look at the world, and any nation which is dominated in the past has been on maritime power, and that is what China is doing now. Why has everybody woken up in the last decade? Is because of the money and the investment which the Chinese have made in the development of the Navy, without a doubt. If you want to be counted in the Indo-Pacific, we have to spend much more to develop maritime capability. I'll stop here.
I'll just quickly add to what Admiral Lamba said. Well, we are focusing, to be specific, besides, of course, the hardware that we're talking about, aircraft carriers and submarines, I think a lot of effort is going into unmanned technologies, force multipliers, network-centric warfare, which isn't visible to everybody. But I think technologically, the Navy is moving ahead quite satisfactorily. We do need hardware. And if you ask me what is our primary requirement right now, it's nuclear attack submarines. I know they're expensive. That's a call the political leadership has to take. And as Admiral Lamba said, if we want to be counted, then we have to have that capability. Otherwise, we're quite happy being a coastal navy, and that's fine. But that's a call that the senior leadership has to take. You can't say, I want to be a big part, but I can't give you the wherewithal to be a big part. It's not going to work that way. Secondly, there's a lot of focus on indigenization, Atmanirbharta. I think it's a fantastic way to go because we've been too dependent and too vulnerable because of our defense imports. But it's not a magic wand. You can't just wake up one morning and say, no buy global from tomorrow morning. It doesn't work that way. And that's the way it's being pushed. You've got to have a comprehensive plan. You've got to have distinct milestones of achieving various things over the next maybe 5, 7, 10, 12, 15 years with this. And at no stage can you afford to compromise your country's combat capability. You cannot say, oh, well, doesn't matter if this is not there. Till it is not indigenized, we don't need it. It doesn't work that way. I'm being very sort of blunt. I'm being very direct, but that's the point I'm trying to make.
It's a good point, sir. And I get a feeling there's two parallel roundtables happening, South China Sea and Indian capability. But let me pull you back to the South China Sea. You had a question.
My name is Sanjay Jha. I'm a foreign correspondent. My question is, recently Chinese new map publication created quite uproar in some part of the world, including India. But as Colin said, and I've been reading, I'm trying to find, has there been any change in terms of the addition of new areas in the new recent map from what it was there in 2016? And also, interestingly, there's some parts from Russia has been shown in the new map. So why Russians have not gone about town, complaining about it? Why this ASEAN and G20 did not take it up? What is the reason behind it?
That's a very good point. Russia actually did object to it. It waited for 4 or 5 days, but then it has raised objections because apparently that island that China is claiming, which is on the Eastern Pacific, had already been settled. It's already been signed by both sides, and now the Chinese are claiming the island. But I'm going to go to Colin to answer this question about what exactly is it that has caused this apprehension. Because I mean, you said that this is an old map, and that extra dash that has come close to Taiwan was there apparently earlier also. But it's another matter that for the last few years we didn't hear very much about it. But Colin, please, and also Colin, please tell us also about what your views are on this thing Q, the code for unplanned encounters at sea. Why hasn't that been invoked when when some of these incidents have happened? Whatever the water cannon incident, etc. Why wasn't Q's resorted to?
Thank you. These the map that was published, obviously, as was being highlighted, it wasn't new, and the apprehension has been seen in the broader context of what's happening in the more recent years. I think more importantly is there is in general increased amount of anxiety and concerns about China. I think one is to bear in mind, as I highlighted also in my presentation, about China's own domestic problems, and by that I'm alluding to the black box of China's strategic intentions. There has always been a subject of interest amongst many of us. We're looking at these particular issue, we're trying to make sense of what China is thinking about, and we are hoping to try to predict what China is doing. And the more recent problems that we have seen that are all interlinked, domestic, economic, and political upheavals, as well as the increased or seemingly increased assertiveness in the South China Sea who have given much imagination about what China might potentially do next. So that, I think, in a good part explains the Southeast Asian countries' response to what China has done in a more recent time. So to understand the regional responses to China and the so-called 10 dash line map, you look at it from the much broader context of how they view China decision-making process and the uncertainties that belie the entire decision-making process. So this answered that one question. On queues, Abhijit, I think you can chime in on that. Queues essentially applies to military forces. At this point, up till now, there has been a lot of discussion about queues applying to so-called maritime law enforcement agencies or coast guards, or what I call White House, whatever you call that. But this is a futile exercise. What I was aware about is that regional coast guards are not exactly very keen to adopt what they see as a Navy document. So they will prefer to have their own document. And amongst a number of countries in the South China Sea, and that includes China, there are at least 4 Southeast Asian countries and China that were drafting what appeared to be the genesis of a Coast Guard specific queues. But whether or not this has been applied leaves very much a lot to question. So that doesn't really apply to the Coast Guards, and that also doesn't apply to what we call irregular forces, such as maritime militia. I would suppose China wouldn't want the maritime militia to be part of the discussion, because the whole idea is that while there is somewhat implicit acknowledgement that they exist, but I don't think they want to put it up front on the table that they are counted as a regular element in the South China Sea. So they want to keep the ambiguity as much as possible. And for that purpose, I think to some extent, Vietnam will do likely the same thing as well. They would not want the maritime militia to be part of it, because this is also part of Vietnam's toolkit in the South China Sea. So because of that, we are faced with queues that is still very much limited. There's some improvement gradually ever since it was being taken up back then. But over time, I think it's clear that it doesn't apply to all forces, which partly also explains why. My argument is that it would be better to have a common document that applies to all of them. And bear with me, the reason is because you can't have a situation that is so clear-cut and clean-cut, meaning out there in the South China Sea, you have Coast Guards versus Coast Guards, navies versus navies. Very often it's much messier than that. So you'll have Coast Guards versus Navy, Coast Guards versus Navy and maritime militia, all types of permutations and combinations you can think about. So you need a common document that ties all of them in. So as for now, the sort of desire to have that common document is very much still on the drawing board. It hasn't taken off. I know that it has been discussed at some of the regional forums, like those under the ASEAN Regional Forum. I participated in some of those working group discussions, but besides the discussion, there is no real movement towards that direction. So we are faced with a hodgepodge of such confidence and security building mechanisms that apply to certain elements, but not the other. I think this is something that we're to live with, and we will try to see how we can, circumvent those challenges going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. We have time for just 2 more questions. And
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at Nottingham Trent University, long distance. So one thing I wanted to understand was Commodore Anil Jai Singh mentioned that, the Bangladeshi base that is being constructed and the presence of the Chinese in the Bay of Bengal. That reminded me that even in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, one island is with Myanmar, and there was suspicion of Chinese military activity there. And in that connection, I wanted to understand also the Chinese, if I remember correctly, I may be wrong on this, once even laid claim to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as a whole. So is that
that's a good question. That's a bit speculative. There was some imagery that was released to say that the Chinese are trying to assist them in creating some surveillance capabilities there. I'm going to turn to you, so just take a short thing at this, because we've got a couple of more on these.
No, I think the Bay of Bengal certainly so far has been, the Indian Navy has been the preeminent naval presence in the Bay of Bengal. The Chinese have been coming. It's not that they haven't come into the Bay of Bengal. They come to Myanmar. Their ships have been operating. But we've never been threatened or felt threatened by them. But if they have a full-fledged base, a submarine base, then certainly, one of the limitations for Chinese submarine deployments in the Indian Ocean is the distance from mainland China to the Indian Ocean. But if they have a place where they can come and replenish, where they can come and get their maintenance done, and more importantly, if they're being tracked from the time they enter the Indian Ocean and then they enter this base, they can be tracked up to that base. But where they go after that, we don't know. So these are the things we need to keep in mind when we see what the submarine, particularly a submarine deployment. And if it's an SSN, a nuclear attack submarine, its possibilities are limitless. It doesn't have endurance challenges, it doesn't have speed challenges, it doesn't have any challenge. So it can operate for long. As far as the island is concerned, I think if you're referring to Cocos, we've been hearing about Chinese activity there for many, many years, over 2 decades or 2.5 decades. But we haven't seen anything substantially affecting our security interests there, at least to the best of my knowledge. I wouldn't be able to comment on that any further.
Thank you.
I'm Shripati. I just got a simple question. Given the way the Chinese are behaving, starting from the Himalayas to the South China Sea and now the 9-dash line becoming 10-dash line, what is their end game? Not just a question of territory. Yeah, not just a question of territory, but all these actions are actually making more enemies than friends. And they are pushing people outside and they're making new enemies every day.
That's a larger theological question. What's the end game? But I'm going to come to Amrita. Amrita, I want you to answer. What's the end game here? And also you, Pooja, hear your thoughts on what you think the big end game is. What's the big idea behind China trying to do all of this?
The ultimate end game is to become a hegemon. That's it. As offensive realist John Mearsheimer says, that's the ultimate aim that you have. And when China, the best theory that explains China is realism. So there is amassing more power gives you greater confidence and greater ambition. And it becomes limitless. And if we don't resist or oppose China's actions, it only gets greater credence, and that it encourages it to act further. So I think end game for it is to be a hegemon. That's
understood. So Amrita says it's just Chinese hegemony, but do you think there's a greater nuance to what's happening with China? Is there a more sophisticated strategy than we are giving them credit for?
Okay, I would see it very simply. I don't know how sophisticated it might sound, but there are only two ways. What Amrita just said, that they want to become the global power as a hegemon, as an alternate leading power. We may call it anything. One is that, and for that, they need to be economically the most powerful country in the world. And if you have to be economically most powerful, it has to be backed with the very powerful navy. So I think these are the two goalposts. And second is to have domestic legitimacy, which any authoritarian government needs to have in terms of, continuing their power within the country.
Good point. So,
Admiral Chopra here. My observation is that in the end, in such discussions, we always end up bean counting, and he's got so many submarines, and I've got so many this and that, and he's growing and he's building ships, and we have been trying to build ships, etc. What's the strategic thinking behind all this? That we don't know, or nobody studied it. For example, the Chinese, for example, the Admiral Liu Yufeng was the guy who actually changed the whole thinking. She knows, Pooja knows the exact name. But he changed the whole thinking of the Chinese military. And he changed the strategic direction from west. They used to always point at the west, and he changed it to the east and to the south. And he learned lessons from the Gulf War. The Chinese studied the Gulf War because they had the same equipment as the Republican Guard. And the Americans came in 3 days, pulverized everything. So they learned a lesson that they have to have new weapons, up-to-date weapons. They can't continue like this. And the 9-dash line, if I may just state, to my mind, is actually the extension of their first island chain. Zheng He came from Hainan. They've got a historical claim on that. The chap who sailed into the Indian Ocean, etc., etc. So it's all part of the first island chain, which they've now secured, and they're now coming to the second island chain, and we'll see what happens there. And last point, I know you want to throw me out, but the last point is that as Holmes of the Naval War College says, this strategy of having bases is all junk. Because suppose they have a base in Amantota. How long will it take for our aircraft to reach there and bomb the place out, whatever ships they may? You must have a logistics train. What the Americans talk about. Everything is at sea. You can do everything at sea. You don't have to have a base because it's very vulnerable. Djibouti is very vulnerable. They've got a jetty, and it can be. Thank you. I want to take on.
Point, sir. You're right that when we talk about bases, it's actually not combat bases, actually logistical bases. As long as you have logistical bases, you can have longer sea legs. You can do much more, and that's exactly what the American strategy was, to initially have the logistical capability. And I think the Chinese have learned from Admiral Mahan and his teachings, and this is the way for a great power, not to fight battles with adversaries, but have a larger narrative in which you can project yourself as being a power that has overriding interests in whatever is happening around in your sort of field of interest. And I think that's what the Chinese are doing. You're also very right about Lu Hua King, sir. And let me just say that in the 80s, he was the one that actually came up, who devised an idea of China having a strategy, active defense within the waters. Before that, it only applied to the land. And for a long time, China actually didn't break out of the island chain. But now they are doing so because they realize that their interests are global. And if they have to be a global power, they have to be present in the Indian Ocean and in other, Atlantic and other oceans. But there's a few more questions, and I'm not going to disappoint you. I'm going to, yes, you, here at the back.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Samedha Jain. I'm a student. So my question is very blunt. My friend here from the Economic Times also brought out the defense expenditure we have on in the Indian Navy. But what about the necklace of diamonds? Do we have enough infrastructure? Do we have enough capabilities that we can actually trust on the necklace of diamonds strategy? Or is it just a sort of a whitewash for the Indian public to stay calm in their house? We do have a sort of a backlog for the OBOR. We have the new economic corridor. But are they as effective as we thought they are? Thank you.
Pearls? The string of pearls. Okay. The counter to the string of pearls. The necklace of diamonds. Okay. So you can take the. But let me just take two more questions because we're running out of time. Yes, please.
My name is Zafar, and I have recently completed PhD on China-West Asia relation. So we talk about China's discursive practices and weaponizing map all about. But where is our discursive practices? I mean, they are changing map or renaming our places, but can't we have, we only have the so-called strong fortress on South Block every time. So can't we propose our own discursive practices and weaponizing map, etc.?
Discursive practices. Is there any other question? Yeah.
Nitin, I'm also a student, and it is very informative lecture for me. So my question is like that, sir, it is an interconnected word and very complex word, and economics dependent on each other country. Like if the Taiwan-China war happened, every word will cost $2 trillion. And we have 13.7 thousand Japanese companies in China, and we have only 1,400 in India. So how the Japan is dependent on China and China is dependent on Japan. And one more thing, like sir, like in 2016, 254 companies left from the China of Japanese companies, and releasing of map. So sir, there is one terminology, narrative economics. So what is China is playing a narrative economics game? Like they are bringing their fleet in the sea, and they come back to the territory. So like it is a narrative economics game. India is lacking that. And how is the war is feasible in this complex economic structure? So because it isn't.
That's an excellent question. Amrita, I'm going to take this question to you. If you remember, a few years back, you did some writing on confrontational coexistence, and his question is exactly that can you be confrontational and yet have ways in which you can sort of coexist and work together? But so there are three questions. First, necklace of pearls, but I'll come to you, sir, if you can answer that. Discursive practices, would you like to take that? Yes. And I'm finally then going to give Admiral the last word on anything that he would like to add. But sir.
Thanks for your question. But necklace of diamonds, I think it's more a figure of speech, actually. We haven't really acknowledged a necklace of diamonds, like we keep hearing the string of pearls. And I think, firstly, I think one thing we have to understand, we don't have the economic clout that China has. So we can't take them on money-wise. We can't sort of just give a lot of economic largesse to them. But personally, I think with the Sagar doctrine having been promulgated in 2015 and thereafter being followed, I think we've done some remarkable work in securing our strategic neighborhood. We've had political pushes and pulls. We've had political upheavals in some of these countries, but we have managed to get most things back on track by and large. And I think from that perspective, the very fact that India today, in the Indian Ocean at least, and also to a certain extent in the Indo-Pacific, is today considered a preferred security partner, is the first responder, is projecting its soft power diplomacy very well, is also getting now into defense exports. All these things without becoming confrontational in an inclusive manner. Multi-sectoral capacity building is not necessarily military capacity building. I think all these are indications that we know what we want to do, and we are doing it as best as we can within the means that we have to address whatever our requirements are. So I don't think that necklace of diamonds is a sort of, no one's trying to pull wool over anybody's eyes. I think it's very much there. We're not calling it that, but our capacity building is headed in the right direction, at least in our strategic neighborhood, right up to, when I say strategic neighborhood, doesn't mean only in the Maldives, it goes up to Mauritius, it goes up to East Africa. So let me say the larger Indian Ocean, so much is happening in the Indo-Pacific as came out today. So we're doing it within our means, and we're trying to do it as best as possible. That's all I would say on that.
So when we talk of discursive practices, in narrative building is common to the foreign policy of all countries now, which is a very normal thing. India too is doing it. So when we talk about global South, that is one kind of discursive, narrative building that India has been doing. Where the only difference from China is that maybe ours is not malevolent. We have a more, cooperative approach to it. And when 120 heads of leaders, when they come for Voice of Global South, and all of them in their speech says Vasudev Kutumbakam one after another, it shows that we have been building that narrative quite well.
Amrita, would you like to take the question on the confrontational
coexistence,
economics, coexistence, etc.?
So actually, the paper I wrote, I put it in the context of India-China boundary dispute, because I argued that the peaceful coexistence, which many Rory Metcalf and all, they argued it from competitive coexistence, and that's where I look at today, and I argued it from confrontational coexistence. So we are having a coexistence, but this peaceful has been now reduced to confrontational, because at the border, it has become now a regular affair, which was not the case earlier. So I don't know how to relate it to South China Sea right now, because confrontation, we are not seeing confrontation. It's as we see in terms of India-China, like not seeing eye to eye. We are not seeing that in South China Sea. I don't know how to picture this case, and especially with economics. I didn't get that clarity. I got the term used, narrative economics, if I'm not wrong. But I don't know, I'm open to discussion, but yeah.
Understood. Colin, would you have to add something before I give Admiral Lamba the final word? Would you have some suggestion to make about how India should tackle the China challenge in its own backyard? Taking some lessons from what's happening in the South China Sea.
Thank you, Abhijit. I'll be very quick about it. I think there is certainly a huge gulf of difference between India and Southeast Asian countries. Say Indonesia, for example, which will want to call itself a middle power. Basically, the bulk of the Southeast Asian countries are considered small states. And usually, the amount of power and amount of influence that these countries have determine how they respond to China. India has way much more at its disposal. So, I wouldn't want to sort of, put the two together. I believe there is a lot more flexibility that India has in dealing with China, whether it is in your immediate backyard or it is in the South China Sea, for example. So I think generally what I will tend to see as a common thread tying both India and Southeast Asian countries together is, if you want to have to respond to China and its gray zone activities, I think it's important to be consistent. It's important to be principled about it. And on that front, I think what really sets India apart from, say, Japan and Australia, who are treaty allies of the US, is the amount of flexibility that you can pursue and you have in terms of driving your foreign policy. So I think that is probably also one reason why China tends to see India in a much different light compared to Japan and Australia. With Japan and Australia, China tend to see them as simply just US puppets. But with India, there is always a hope that Beijing has that India will be more autonomous and will continue to drive its own foreign policy without influence from anyone. So I think that is one strength that India can play in order to deal with China in a way. It is less inflexible compared to how Japan and Australia can play the game generally.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. And Admiral Lanba, you have the final words. Close this for us.
The focus was the 10-dash line in the South China Sea. Now, the issue is the states involved in the dispute in the South China Sea are all hedging their bets. Okay, the interlinkages and dependencies which all the ASEAN members have with China economically is huge. The differential in power between individual nations and China is so wide that there is no question of anyone individually or taking on China militarily. Okay, and there has been a renewed focus in the Indo-Pacific and especially in the Western Pacific of the Biden administration. But now there is also a doubt what's going to happen in 2024. And if Donald Trump comes back, what is going to be the state of play of the United States in the Indo-Pacific? The second point I want to make is, where is China headed? She is the second largest economy in the world. The prophecy of it overtaking United States and becoming the largest economy is now being put on the back burners. But what China is trying to do, in my opinion, is to change the Bretton Woods system, which was put in place, and the rule-based order post the Second World War. And she's trying to change the rule-based order. And I think the most simpler way to put it is with Chinese character. Whatever new standards which need to be laid out, say you take AI or 5G and all that, all those protocols, China would like to have a stamp on it. And as its national power has gone over the years, she is going to push back on the present system of world governance and the rule-based order and try to put forth its own prophecy and the rule-based orders which she wants, that she can be a regional hegemon and a dominant power in the globe. I think I'll stop here. It's been an interesting discussion. Thank you for all the questions which were thrown at me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for being such a great audience today. I'd like to also thank all of our speakers today for your wonderful thoughts. This has been a very thought-provoking discussion, and I think we discussed far more than we set out to. I thought this is going to be limited to South China Sea, maybe the Eastern Indian Ocean, but this was much more than I had at least bargained for. So thank you very much, everyone. Can we give a round of applause to our participants? Thank you very much, all of you. Colin, thank you. Admiral Lanba, Amrita, thanks very much for joining us. And hopefully our next discussion here at the ORF as part of the series will be equally well attended, and we'll see the same level of participation as we've seen today. But thank you all. Thanks.